Hey everyone, Matt and Lockie here, back for another session connecting UIFlow with Xano. Last session we covered how to bring data in from Xano and start to display that information in UIFlow as a repeating group. And in today's session we're going to show you how to create an authentication workflow so users can sign in, log in, and then we're also going to make sure that you can authenticate your API calls, because we want to make sure that we add security to the various API endpoints that we create in Xano. So good to have you here today, Matt. Good seeing your face again.
Yeah, excited for talking about authentication today.
Always a fun topic. I thought at a very starting point, we cover a very basic workflow of how authentication works. And essentially, authentication is what's securing your application or protecting your sensitive data from unwanted visitors. And really, how we control this is based on a user. You need to know who it is that's accessing your system. Then based off knowing who that user is, we can create a whole range of different security processes to make sure that user gets the correct information. So the workflow we're going to follow today is essentially we're going to connect our login and sign up pages, which Matt's going to show you how to build in UIFlow. And really what we're looking to do is we're looking to take the user's username and password. We're either looking to either log in or sign up that user, which we're doing through UIFlow's front end. We're then passing that information to Xano, which we're going to confirm that the details are correct. We're then going to generate an auth token using Xano's native authentication system. And then we're going to take that auth token and we're going to return that back to UIFlow. And they're going to save that auth token for the user. So that way, when we then try to process any more requests to Xano, we can then use this stored authentication token to validate that user and make sure we get a response. Xano makes this quite easy because out of the box, you'll notice that when you set up your systems, you're able to include a auth login, an auth me, and auth sign up point automatically for you. That's part of your sign up workflow. And we'll start initially with the sign up flow and get a bit of an idea about what's actually happening behind the scenes to sign up your user and to make sure that, that the details are validated. So going into this API endpoint, we'll see that we've got a few different inputs. We want the name of the user, their email address, and their password. And what we're first doing is we're actually doing a request to our user table. We're first checking to see, does this user exist? So if the user doesn't exist already, we're going to then add the user and we're going to create an authentication token. And upon successfully creating that user, we're returning this authentication token back to the front end, the UIFlow. So they're able to store that token and then again, authenticate future calls from there as well. Inside of your auth token, you'll see that you're able to actually set when does your auth token expire? And by default, we set it to 24 hours. But if you have more sensitive information, you want your users to get logged out after an hour, you have the option to adjust the expiration date of your auth token here. Same thing too with our login. We're going to do a very similar process, except instead of creating a new user, we're first checking to see if the user exists, and then we're validating that the password received is correct. And you'll note that we've used a particular input field here, which is a password field. And inbuilt into our database, by default, you'll actually have some requirements for your passwords, which you can add into the database. Under the password field, you can actually control what minimum characters are required. So if you need 6 letters and a number, you can define that into the schema of the password field, which is a unique data type within Xano. But same process, once we've checked that the user exists, we're validating the password, making that sure it's passed. And if they have provided the correct details, we're giving them that expiration date again, or giving them the auth token that's going to expire after 24 hours. We do have one last default call as well, which is the auth me login. By default, all you receive from Xano when you log in a user is the auth token itself. So we have this auth me endpoint, which you'll see has authentication required for it. And what this really does is Xano, by default, when you pass an authentication token across as part of your request in your headers, which Matt will show you how to do in just a moment, what Xano does is it takes that authentication token, which is a long string of text, and then converts that into the user's ID, assuming that it's a valid token. So we then know what is the ID of that user from our user table. We're able to get that detail of that user by matching the ID field from the user table to the auth ID we've received, which is a special variable which we can access under the auth section here. So we've taken the long string or the auth token that we received from the user, and we return just the ID. So Xano does this natively. And for this auth me endpoint, we're taking the details of the user and we're returning this back to the front end. So when a user logs in, you might say, hi Lachlan or hi Matt. How we can do that is we first log in the user, we then contact the auth me endpoint to identify who that user is, and we can then display that on our front end. So as a basic workflow, the user will sign in via our login and our sign up endpoints. It'll receive the auth token into UIFlow, and then we'll begin to use that auth token for all our future requests. And we'll get Matt now to show you how to connect your sign up and your login endpoints within your UIFlow workspace.
Awesome. Thanks, Lachlan. Let's jump into UIFlow, kind of where we took off on the previous project. We had our homepage, kind of our sidebar, and then our repeating group that we mentioned. So kind of what the first thing we want to do is just create a simple login page. So what we'll do is go to our Explorer. We'll just add a new page in here, and we'll just call this the login. And on this right side, we're going to default the URL slug here. I'm just going to make it lowercase just for best practices. And then what we'll do is we're going to add in just a login form. So I'm going to go over to our patterns page and scroll down, and I'll see that there's a login form that I can just drag in just one from the start here. So we can always edit after the fact, but for the purpose of this works for our design. And now what we're going to do is actually configure the authentication endpoints that we just looked over in Xano. So in UIFlow, I'm going to go up to this top auth tab, authentication. So then I'm going to configure and can choose whichever provider that we want here. So for us, we're going to choose Xano.
Of course.
And then you'll see that obviously what we'll do here is now just fill in kind of what the corresponding login URLs and me URLs from our endpoints here. So I'm going to just slide over here. I'm going to copy the login endpoint. I'm going to paste it there. And then I'm going to copy the endpoint. Yeah, so kind of just matching the URLs here. So copying the me endpoint, and I can just easily copy it there. And then I can just going to confirm. I'm not going to do a session timeout because I want to control that on the back end. So I'm going to confirm that. And now, if I want to go into my actual login page, I'm going to go to the logic tab. And now I'm going to add in my email input and my password input and my login button. So
these are all elements from the page, are they? So you're accessing items from your design page, and they're now available in the logic section.
Correct, exactly right. So you'll see that the differentiation here from the design references, and you'll see that, hey, these are used one time here.
Perfect.
And then, yeah, so just drag in the login button, email input, and password, because then I'm going to get those values. And the other thing I'm going to do is now I'm going to search for my authentication specific component. And so we're using Xano Auth. So I'm going to drag my Xano Auth component in. And what I'm going to do is essentially say on click my login, I want to log in with username. And the username is the email. And password is the password. And what I can do now is say on login, we're just going to go to the home page just for a simple test. So I'm going to say my home page is just the slash. So now that I have that configured, I'm going to just do a quick little test. I know what one of the login names is, just my own, and then
and these are users you've added to the Xano database, is that correct?
Correct, yes. So yeah, so this user's already in there. So I'm just going to do a test login, and I put the wrong password in. I can count, so it is working there. But we can also then configure specific errors. But so now if I do a login, see that I actually was able to log in. Brings us back to our home page, and uh, we can see that our endpoint is working, and we see our contact cards from our uh, previous episode. So we can see that our authentication is now working. Um, so now kind of the next part would be is actually to secure these endpoints using specific tokens.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I can show you how we can do that in Xano, because obviously what we've done with our last setup is we've taken those API, we've basically left those API endpoints exposed. So our last call, we didn't actually pass an auth token through via header. So I'll show you now how we can adjust the API endpoint in Xano to make sure that it's secured and that unwanted users can't access that. So before we get into securing our data, I wanted to show you first what data do we have. And contacts are really what we're trying to display on our front end. And we only want contacts to display for a user that's related to the company that owns the contacts. And how we've got our database schema set up is we've got relationships between our user and our company. So a user belongs to a company. And we also have our contacts that belong to a company as well. So what we need to do is we need to validate that for each call we do to our contacts endpoint, we need to make sure that we only return the related records to the company. So to get into that, I'm going to head to our endpoints, and we're going to use the contacts endpoint again, and we're querying all the contacts. So last time, like we mentioned, if we run this query at the moment, we're getting all of our records back. The problem with this is I can actually copy the endpoint URL and I can paste this into my browser, and anybody on the internet can access our contact records, which is not a good practice. Of course, we're going to get into some issues with that, particularly if we have sensitive data. So how we can control that is we can add authentication to the endpoint, meaning that we have to verify and tell Xano who we are in order to get access. So to do that, we can basically select our users table and add that to the API endpoint. And like any item in Xano, until we actually publish this is not going to be live on our UIFlow front end, but we've got a few more adjustments to do before we make this work. So to check that I've added the correct user table, I can now open up my run and debug. We'll see here as part of our test to make sure this endpoint works, we can now emulate a user. And the user we're using on our front end, you saw, is matt@uiflow.com. So if we now run this, we can check to see, is Matt an authenticated user? Yes, he is. And we're now getting all our records returned. Now that's great, but Matt may not have access to all these contacts. We might have multiple companies within our system. So how are we going to ensure that we only receive the records that relate to Matt's company? We need to first get some more information about the user to work out how we could do that. So adjusting our API call here a little bit, we're going to, we've now received the user's ID because we've exchanged that auth token and we've gotten the ID back, but we don't know what the company is that Matt belongs to. So we first need to get that information. So we can do a get record request to our user table, and we're going to find the user based on the auth ID that we've received. And I'm going to put a stop and debug here just to show you exactly what we're getting back from this. So I'm going to put a stop and debug right here after the first step. And that's just going to stop the function right where it is and return to me the value that I've selected. So we can now see that we've got Matt from UIFlow, and we've got, importantly, this company ID. So now that we know which company our user belongs to in this user1 variable, we're able to create a custom query to our contacts table and only return the contacts that relate to that company. So how we can do that is inside of our custom query here, we're able to choose the different database items from our context table. We can see that there's the table relationship we created earlier, which is contact to company ID. And we're wanting to now find, we know the user one variable contains the company ID of the user. And we're going to access that with dot notation again. So we're now only going to find all of the company ID, the contacts that have the same company ID as our user. So I know in our database we've got 5 contacts, but only 4 of those contacts belong to UIFlow and to Matt. So when we run this, we should receive 4 records: ID2, ID3, ID4, and ID5. And if we check our database, we can see that in the contacts table, we've got 5 records. And if we check then the company ID column, we can see that 4 out of these 5 records are owned by UIFlow. So we're now correctly returning the records that relate to the user. So we're exchanging the auth token, we're getting the user's ID, we're then querying our users table to return the related information from that user. We're then taking the company ID of that user, and then we're searching our contacts table to only return the related contacts against that particular company. And as an output, we're returning the contacts that exist to our front end. So in order to now access this from our front end, we're going to need to update our existing call that we had, but we need to include the authentication token as part of our headers. So I'm going to get Matt to show you how to do this now.
All right, thanks. So now what we'll do is jump back into UIFlow, and we need to do a couple things. One, we'll need to add the authentication token to our API call, as well as the one thing we also want to do in terms of securing our homepage. So we added the login form, and then upon authentication, we would go to our homepage. So now the one thing we do also want to do is go to our page properties for our homepage. And on this right side, we'll see an authentication layer. So this is going to actually rely on that authentication configuration we did with Xano. So I'm just going to flip that toggle. And then when someone isn't authenticated, we'll redirect them to the login page. So that's one thing that we wanted to do there.
So the authentication token secures the backend and the front end, because you've added that requirement that also the front end needs to have an auth token as well. So both our front end and our backend APIs are now secured by that auth token provided by Xano.
Exactly. So now, yeah, there, I think my session is still logged in. Yeah, so my session is still logged in, but you'll see that my API call, I see no results because we haven't configured that endpoint yet in passing the auth token. So what we'll do now, what we need to do there is we'll go into our connection tab where we have our Xano APIs. So we have our contact table, and we'll see that we have an auth token field right here. And because we're going to be dynamically passing that in based on the login, we're just going to click expose here. And we'll see now in our component, we have this auth token node that we can now pass in the auth token that we get back from the backend. So similar to Lachlan, make sure that we publish this so that it gets updated into our component here. And so we'll see on the homepage now, we have this auth token that we need to pass in. So we're in our homepage here. Just looking at our login, we have our Xano auth set up here, but we actually need the token. So what we're going to do here is in our homepage, we can grab that same Xano auth component. And what we're going to do now is open up our actions menu. And so I'm going to delete the logins, and I'm going to actually search for on token. So we could also do the get token. You'll see that you can always just get the token that we have available. But for this one, because it's on a separate page, I'm going to actually just do when we receive that new authentication token back, we're going to essentially then call our API when we load the page, and we're going to pass in that auth token. So I'm going to delete this for now. And so what we can do now is I'm going to do another pop out, but I'm going to go into our login page. And so we logged in as Matt at UIFlow.com, that user. Make sure I put the password correctly. Now, if I click login, we'll see that in our flow, oops, page, we did pass in our authentication token into our call there, and we see that we got our 4 records back. So that's the simple way of how you authenticate that token, and then you'll can easily pass that into your API Xano component to authenticate it.
That's awesome. And there's a lot covered there. So, we've now got the ability to make sure that our app, so on our front end, we're making sure that all of our pages, like our home page that we redirect to after the home, anything that needs to be secured, so it's not public facing, which is generally everything other than maybe your login page and your sign up page, you need to make sure that it requires that auth token in order to basically access the page, or we're redirecting the user back to the login page to confirm that there is an auth token that exists. So the front end, meaning your users now can't access pages unless they provide that auth token. And also on the back end, we want to make sure that all of our APIs also require that auth token as well. So we need to make sure that the user verifies who they are before they receive any information from either the front end or the back end. So really important that you add this into your application in the early stages to ensure that you've got a secure system to build with.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, kind of that recap, we configured that auth configuration using those endpoints, and then in our connection, we also then added that passing in the auth token that is required. So yeah, awesome. And then one more thing we wanted to add and kind of show how the authentication is working is by adding a logout functionality to this as well. So what we'll do here is I'm just going to drag in a simple button into my sidebar here. I'm going to change the text to say logout. And for best practices, I'm also going to rename this button, say logout button. And so now we have our logout button. And so now I'm just going to add that logic to our logic tab here. So in my logic flow, I'm just going to create a new flow here. I'm calling it logout. And so now I'm going to search in my design references for my logout button. I'm going to search for my Xano auth component, drag that in. And same thing, I'm going to search now in my component actions for logout, and there's no space there. So I'm going to grab my logout, and I'm going to, just for housekeeping, I'll delete that. So now I'm going to say when we log out, we're going to log out of our Xano authentication. And we're then going to send our user, when they click logout, back to the login screen.
So what's happening when that logout button is happening with the Xano auth? What's happening behind the scenes there, Matt? When that logout action happens in Xano auth, it's basically just forgetting that auth token that we received from Xano. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's also then, yeah, so you don't have that auth token to authenticate against it's forgetting it against the page. So you won't have access to the page anymore, as well as the API endpoints won't have that token.
Perfect. And the only way to get a new token is
right.
then to re-log in again.
Exactly. And we'll see that we can kind of share. So I'll do a quick kind of preview out. So we'll see that I'm actually not logged in right now. So if I try to access that home page, we set that redirect back to our login screen. So now if I re-log in, it's going to take me back to my homepage, logged in, authenticated, because I see my 4 contacts. And so now if I click log out, it's going to then kill my session and take me to my login screen. And we'll see that I'm officially logged out because it's forgotten that I've been authenticated here. So I'd have to re-log in to access my homepage and my data.
That's awesome. The Xano auth plugin makes it really easy to connect with Xano. That's it's awesome. I hope you are able to get some value from this session. This is the second session in our series. We're going to continue building out this application and look to really show you some more advanced features as well. So if you are building with UIFlow and Xano, make sure you leave us a comment. If there's a particular question you have or something you'd like to see in our future sessions, just leave us a comment below and make sure you give us a like as well. And we look forward to seeing you on the next session.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate your time, Matt. Speak to you again soon.
Yeah.